At 11 o'clock at night on the 8th of May 1945, the guns went quiet along a front line in western Latvia that ran roughly 137 miles from the Baltic coast to the Gulf of Riga. General Karl Hilpert, Commander-in-Chief of Army Group Courland, had ordered his two armies to end hostilities. The German garrison of Berlin had surrendered 6 days earlier, on the 2nd of May. The instrument of unconditional surrender had already been signed. In Courland, the 16th Army and the 18th Army were still holding an unbroken defensive line, still occupying ground they had held since the previous October, and still in contact with Soviet forces. The prisoner count taken from that pocket was 189,112. 42 of them were generals, 8,038 were officers, 181,032 were enlisted men. Roughly 14,000 Latvians laid down arms alongside them. The pocket had held for 211 days. The severing began in the summer of 1944, and it did not begin in Latvia. It began in Belarus, with the Soviet offensive that dismantled Army Group Center. That collapse tore a gap in the German front hundreds of miles wide, and left Army Group North holding the Baltic states with its southern flank hanging on nothing. Every position Army Group North occupied in Estonia and Latvia now depended on a single land corridor running southwest into East Prussia, and that corridor was narrowing month by month. The corridor closed for the first time on the 30th of July, 1944. The Soviet 2nd Guards Army had found the seam between the 16th Army of Army Group North and the 3rd Panzer Army of Army Group Center, exploited it during the Corners and Šiauliai offensives, and driven north to the Gulf of Riga at Tukums. Army Group North was cut off from Germany by land more than 2 months before the pocket that would define it. That first severing lasted 4 weeks because the German army reversed it. Operation Doppelkopf opened in the middle of August 1944. Generaloberst Erhard Raus ran it with the 3rd Panzer Army, using the 40th Panzer Corps under Otto von Knobelsdorff and the 39th Panzer Corps under Dietrich von Sorcken. The 7th and 14th Panzer Divisions were committed, along with the Grossdeutschland Panzer Grenadier Division. The objective was to drive north to Tukums and restore physical contact with the 16th Army. By the 27th of August, it had done exactly that. A land corridor roughly 18 miles wide ran to Tukums, linking Army Group North to Army Group Center again. And Bagramian's 1st Baltic Front had been checked south of the Dvina. The wider objectives were not met. Šiauliai was not retaken, and the Soviet 6th Guards Army pressing toward Riga was not cut off. The corridor itself was thin, exposed on both flanks, and dependent on holding a coastal strip an enemy had already crossed once. Doppelkopf established the fact that governs everything after it. The land link to Army Group North could be cut, and it could be restored, and the German army had restored it with 2 Panzer Corps in 12 days. In August, that corridor was worth a major counter-offensive with the Grossdeutschland committed to it. 6 weeks later, when the corridor was cut a second time, no counter-offensive came. One more attempt was made before that. Operation Caesar opened on the 16th of September 1944, using the same 2 Panzer Corps under the 3rd Panzer Army, and its purpose was to widen and secure what Doppelkopf had only managed to touch. The target was the Soviet salient below Riga and the 6th Guards Army inside it. The attack penetrated a few miles and ground to a halt by the 19th of September. The corridor was not enlarged, and it was not secured. Caesar was the last German offensive aimed at keeping Army Group North connected to Germany by land. Everything that followed was withdrawal, static defence or movement by sea. While Caesar was failing in the south, Army Group North was giving up ground in the north. Operation Aster ran from the 17th to the 26th of September 1944, and it was Schörner's plan to pull the army group out of mainland Estonia before it could be trapped there. Tallinn was taken on the 22nd of September. The Estonian mainland was given up in 10 days, and the force that had held it moved south into Latvia, adding its weight to a position that was itself about to be isolated. The Riga offensive had already opened on the 14th of September. Soviet forces pressed the Riga axis while Army Group North compressed around the city, and the corridor Doppelkopf had bought in August thinned back toward the width it had started at. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner commanded Army Group North throughout. By the start of October, the corridor to East Prussia was still open, and it had narrowed to a strip that Soviet planners could see as clearly as the Germans could. General Ivan Bagramian commanded the First Baltic Front, and Bagramian's plan was built on a deception. He concentrated up to half his force west of Šiauliai while working to convince German command that the main weight of the attack would fall on Riga. The Germans reinforced toward Riga. Bagramian attacked toward the sea. The Memel Offensive opened on the 5th of October 1944 on a 60-mile front against Erhard Raus and the 3rd Panzer Army. The point of impact was a relatively weak Volksgrenadier division. That division collapsed on the first day. 4 days of movement followed. On the 9th of October 1944, the Soviet 43rd Army reached the Baltic coast south of Memel, and the 5th Guards Tank Army reached the coast to the north. The two thrusts isolated the city and cut the land link between Army Group North and East Prussia. No counter-offensive followed. The 3rd Panzer Army that had run Doppelkopf and Caesar was the formation struck first on the 5th of October, and it was now being pushed back on its own front, with the Volksgrenadier Division at the point of impact already gone. There was nothing left on the southern side of the gap to drive north with, and Army Group North had nothing on the northern side to drive south. Riga fell 4 days after the corridor did. Soviet forces of the 3rd Baltic Front took the city on the 13th of October 1944. The 18th Army withdrew through Riga into Courland, leaving a screening force built around the 227th Infantry Division and the guns of the 6th Motorized Anti-Aircraft Division to hold the crossings, and demolished the bridges behind it as it went. Memel itself did not fall with the corridor. The city that gave the offensive its name was held as a separate German bridgehead on the coast, cut off by land, supplied from the sea, and it held that way for roughly 3 months. Its position became untenable only when the East Prussian offensive of January 1945 bypassed it and advanced far beyond it, at which point the bridgehead was defending nothing. Hitler authorized the evacuation on the 22nd of January. The last German units left Memel in the early hours of the 28th of January 1945, and Soviet forces entered the harbour a few hours later. The 28th Corps withdrew into Samland, and the 95th and 58th Infantry Divisions were lifted onto the Curonian Spit. Memel is the control case for everything that happened in Courland. A cut-off Baltic bridgehead, supplied by sea, was evacuated cleanly once the order was given, and the men in it were returned to the German order of battle in time to be used. The order was given for Memel in January. It was never given for Courland. What remained on the peninsula was a garrison, with the Baltic Sea to the west, the Elbe Strait to the north, the Gulf of Riga to the east, and the Red Army across the base of it. The pocket ran from Tukums in the northeast to Liepaja in the southwest. Approximately 200,000 combat troops were inside it, largely the 16th Army and the 18th Army. The German historian Werner Haupt puts the figure at 203,000. Higher figures circulate for the Courland garrison, and some of them roughly double that count. Those larger numbers sweep in every service branch present on the peninsula, including naval personnel, Air Force ground staff, rear echelon administration and construction units, and civilians in German service. Measured against divisional strength, they do not describe the force holding the line. The fighting strength of the pocket was approximately 200,000. The number of divisions in that force is a question the sources have never settled. Some accounts give 26, others give 33. The spread is not a rounding disagreement, and no reconstruction of the pocket resolves it, because divisions entered, left by sea, were broken down into battle groups, and were reconstituted under the same numbers across the 7 months that followed. The terrain worked for the defence. Courland is low, wet ground, and the fighting ran through forest, swamp, waterlogged trench lines and flooded craters. Rivers such as the Varta and rises such as the Latila Heights channeled armoured advances into narrow approaches that German anti-tank guns had already registered. On a front of 137 miles, Army Group North built defence in depth, with belts of barbed wire, minefields and anti-tank ditches. A peninsula that could not be reinforced by land also could not be flanked. Every attack on it had to go through the front, into prepared positions, on ground that gave armour almost nowhere to spread out. The decision that kept the garrison there was made in Berlin, and it was Hitler's. The military case for evacuation was direct. The force was cut off. It could be supplied only by sea. It held ground of no operational value to the defence of Germany, and it represented roughly 200,000 trained troops standing idle, while East Prussia, Pomerania and Silesia were being overrun. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, chief of the General Staff at the Army High Command, argued for withdrawal repeatedly and did not get it. Hitler's reasoning rested on the Baltic. He ordered the forces in Courland and on the Estonian islands of Hiiumaa and Saaremaa to hold, on the grounds that they were necessary to protect German submarine bases along the Baltic coast. Behind that order was the Type XXI U-boat, the new class that Grand Admiral Karl Donitz believed could reopen the Battle of the Atlantic and force the Western Allies out of Europe. The Baltic held the last two U-boat training areas. Holding Courland in that reading kept the training water open. There was a second argument, political rather than naval. A force in Courland fixed Soviet armies in Latvia that would otherwise be free to move on East Prussia, and it kept a German presence on former Soviet territory at a moment when every other front was moving west. Neither argument survives the arithmetic. The Soviet forces committed against Courland were not the forces deciding Berlin, and the divisions locked on the peninsula were not defending anything the German war effort still needed. In the middle of January 1945, Guderian obtained a partial concession. Hitler authorized the withdrawal of 7 divisions from Courland by sea. He refused a total withdrawal. Those 7 went out through Liepaja and Ventspils. Among them were the 4th Panzer Division and the 31st, 32nd and 93rd Infantry Divisions, with several others lifted out as remnants rather than as formations. They were carried to East Prussia and Danzig, and from those ports some were moved on again toward Germany and Denmark. The sea lift proved the point the rest of the argument had failed to make. Shipping existed. Ports existed. The evacuation of the pocket was a decision, not a capability. On the 21st of January 1945, Schörner left for Army Group Centre. On the 25th of January, Army Group North was renamed Army Group Courland. The rename is often read as a verdict, as the moment German command formally wrote the force off and named it after the ground it was stranded on. The record is thinner than that. It was part of a 3-way redesignation Hitler ordered across the Eastern Front at the same time, in which Army Group Centre became Army Group North and Army Group A became Army Group Centre. The Courland rename was administrative bookkeeping inside a general reshuffle of titles. It changed the letterhead. It changed nothing about the position, the supply line or the order to hold. Command of the Army Group then moved 4 times in under 3 months. Generaloberst Lothar Rendulic held it at the rename. Generaloberst Heinrich von Vietinghoff took it on the 27th of January. Rendulic returned on the 19th of March. General Karl Hilpert took it on the 6th of April and held it to the end. 4 commanders in 72 days, in a static position, against an enemy that was not moving either, is a measure of how little the German command expected any of them to change the outcome. Vietinghoff, during his weeks in command, drew up a plan. It was a full evacuation of Army Group Courland by sea from Liepaja and Ventspils. He put the shipping question to Donitz, and Donitz confirmed that sufficient shipping was available to lift the force. The plan went to Hitler. Hitler refused it. The garrison stayed. Against that garrison, Soviet forces ran 6 major offensives between October 1944 and April 1945. The Leningrad Front under Marshal Leonid Govorov and the Second Baltic Front under Andrei Yeryomenko carried the weight of them. German veterans of the pocket later named these the 6 battles of Courland, and the term needs handling. It is a post-war construct. The fighting in Courland did not stop between the numbered battles, and there was no period in which the front was quiet. German sources disagree on the date windows for 5 of the 6. What the term describes accurately is 6 periods in which Soviet forces concentrated artillery and armour and attempted a decisive breakthrough. What it describes inaccurately is a rhythm of discrete engagements separated by pauses, which is not what the men in the trench line experienced. The first came in October 1944, immediately after the pocket closed, opening with a heavy artillery preparation on the Riga axis. The German line bent and held. The second ran from late October into November, aimed at compressing the pocket and cutting Liepaja away from it. Liepaja mattered more than terrain, because Liepaja was the port and the port was the supply line. It held. The third came before the end of the year, in December, seeking a breakthrough on a narrower frontage. The fourth came in January 1945, pressing toward Liepaja and Saldus. It was running at the same time Guderian was extracting his 7 divisions, and Vietinghoff was drafting an evacuation the garrison would never be permitted to carry out. The fifth came in February, with the main effort toward Dinchster. The sixth ran through March into April, and it was the last. By the time it ended, Soviet strategic attention had moved to the Oder and to Berlin. None of the 6 produced a breakthrough. The line moved, positions changed hands, and the pocket was compressed at the edges, and at no point in 211 days did Soviet forces split Army Group Courland or collapse it. The reasons were terrain, depth of defence, and the fact that a peninsula presents no flank. The cost is measurable. Grigory Krivashev's reconstruction of Soviet losses covers the period from the 16th of February to the 8th of May 1945. In those roughly 11 weeks, Soviet forces at Courland recorded 30,501 irrecoverable losses and 130,447 medical losses. The total is 160,948. That figure covers less than half the life of the pocket, and it excludes the entire first 4 offensives, against a garrison of approximately 200,000 that was never relieved, never reinforced by land, and never permitted to leave. The Red Army recorded losses in the final quarter of the siege on a scale comparable to the size of the force it was trying to reduce. The Soviet reasoning for pressing those attacks is the mirror image of the German reasoning for staying. 6 Soviet armies were committed to containing the peninsula, and the Russian historian Alexei Isayev identifies the primary objective as preventing exactly what Vietinghoff had planned. If the garrison were lifted out by sea, roughly 200,000 troops would arrive in Germany at the moment the Oder line was being decided. The offensives existed to keep the force pinned to the ground rather than to take the ground. 2 other motives sat behind that. Soviet command did not assume the pocket would sit still, and a land breakout toward East Prussia or a strike into the flank of forces moving west was treated as a live possibility that had to be preempted. Beyond the military calculation, reducing Courland meant holding the Baltic states in full at the end of the war, which was a political outcome with a value independent of any German division. The Soviet assessment shifted over the winter. From December 1944, significant Soviet units were withdrawn from the Courland front and sent where they mattered more, and the later operations increasingly resembled blockade rather than conquest. By April 1945, with no German capacity to use the force anywhere, Soviet planners could regard the garrison as self-supporting prisoners who had not yet been collected. Both commands had reached the same conclusion about the pocket's value. Only one of them was still ordering attacks on it. Supply ran on water for all 211 days. Liepaja was the main port, with Ventspils working alongside it, and the sea lane to Germany carried ammunition, fuel, rations and replacements in, and wounded out. It was the only line the pocket had. It also explains why the second Soviet offensive aimed at Liepaja rather than at the centre of the line, and why the garrison spent its strength holding a coastal city rather than shortening its front. On the 12th of March 1945, Hitler authorised a cuff title for the men in the pocket, on the recommendation of the Army Group Commander. It carried the word Courland, the coat of arms of the Grand Master of the Order, and the elk's head from the arms of Mitau. To qualify, a soldier needed 3 combat engagements in the pocket, or 3 uninterrupted months in the Army Group zone, or a wound taken there. It was the last German award instituted in the Second World War. Distribution began in late April, less than 2 weeks before the surrender. Berlin fell first. The garrison of the capital surrendered on the 2nd of May 1945, when General Helmuth Weidling signed the order and passed it to Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov of the 8th Guards Army. Hitler had been dead since the 30th of April. Donitz was head of state. In Courland, the front line did not move. The 16th and 18th Armies remained in position, still in contact, still holding the same ground they had held since the 9th of October. For 6 days after the capital was gone, an intact German army group was conducting an active defence on the Baltic. On the 7th of May, Donitz ordered Hilpert to surrender Army Group Courland. Hilpert opened contact with Marshal Leonid Govorov of the Leningrad front and signalled his own troops that a ceasefire had been agreed. Hostilities ended at 11 o'clock at night on the 8th of May 1945. The surrender did not arrive everywhere at once. Parts of the army group were in a communications blackout and did not receive the order until the 10th of May, and small elements were still moving toward the coast in the hope of a passage out after the ceasefire hour had passed. Most units held to the order. Soviet collection of the prisoners was completed by the 23rd of May. What went into captivity is the hardest number in the subject: 189,112 prisoners, 42 generals, 8,038 officers, and 181,032 men. Roughly 14,000 Latvians surrendered with them. German record-keeping and English-language scholarship arrive at that exact total independently of one another, working from different documents, which is what gives it its weight. Very few figures from the last month of the war in Europe are that firm. Older Soviet records list a small account of about 146,000 German and Latvian prisoners, including 28 generals and 5,083 officers, and current scholarship has superseded it. The generals alone settle which count is closer. 42 general officers passed into Soviet custody from Courland, and general officers are the one category of prisoner that both sides had every reason to count precisely. One claim about Courland is repeated more than any other, and it is false. Army Group Courland was not the last German army group to surrender. Army Group Centre, under Schörner, the same officer who had commanded in Courland until January, capitulated on the 11th of May 1945 in Czechoslovakia at the close of the Prague Offensive. That is 3 days after the Courland ceasefire. Schörner himself had already left his command and flown to Austria, where American forces arrested him on the 18th of May. The true claim is stronger than the false one. Army Group Courland was still fighting 6 days after Berlin fell. It was still holding a continuous defensive front, with 2 armies in the line, when the capital of the Reich had already been in Soviet hands for the better part of a week. It surrendered as a formed body, at full strength, in position, undefeated on the ground it occupied, having been ordered to surrender rather than forced to. The prisoners went east. The bulk of the garrison was held first in camps in the Valdai Hills before being moved deeper into the Soviet interior, and the men of Army Group Courland were not repatriated on the timescale that applied to German prisoners taken in the West. Most of the survivors were released in the early 1950s. The last group did not come home until 1955, after Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's visit to Moscow. 10 years in captivity for a position that was surrendered intact. Karl Hilpert did not survive it. The commander who signed the ceasefire was tried in Soviet custody and died in Moscow on the 1st of February 1947. The 211 days brought nothing. The Type XXI U-boat program never reached operational scale, and the training water Hitler kept the garrison in Latvia to protect produced no campaign. The Soviet armies at Courland were not the armies that took Berlin. East Prussia, Pomerania and Silesia were overrun while roughly 200,000 trained troops held a peninsula that no plan required. Bienhoff's evacuation was feasible. Donitz confirmed the shipping for it. The 7 divisions lifted out in January proved the mechanism worked, and Memel proved the order could be given. The Ground Army Group Courland held from the 9th of October 1944 to the 8th of May 1945 was the last occupied Soviet territory in the war. It was handed over rather than taken.